Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Saima Saleji, one of the conveners of BERA's Race, Ethnicity and Education Special Interest Group. Please note that both presentations will be recorded and the presenters will address questions and comments during the last 30 minutes of the discussion time. So please mute yourselves during the presentations and use the chat function to ask any questions or wait until both presentations are completed. So today I have the privilege of introducing two very well-known Scottish scholars, Professor Khatija Mohammed and Dr. Navan Govinda. For me and for many scholars like me, Khatija and Navan are Scottish advocates who have dedicated their professional lives in promoting social justice and equitable education for all. They are dedicated mentors to numerous new and established school teachers, college lecturers, and university-based academics. So thank you very, very much, Khatija, and thank you very much, Navan, for all the great work and for all volunteering to share your exceptional work with us today. The first presentation will be delivered by Professor Khatija Mohammed. As we know, she is Associate Dean of EDI at the University of West of Scotland. She's a prominent anti-racist activist in Scotland and the co-founder and chair of the Scottish Association of Minority Ethnic Educators since 2013. Khatija is a multi-award-winning scholar who was elected as the first Muslim woman of color to hold the post of convener of the General Teaching Council for Scotland in 2022. One of her most recent works showcases people's perceptions on the recruitment, retention, and promotion of minority ethnic teachers. And our second presenter is Dr. Navan Govinda. Navan is a scholar activist whose interdisciplinary research and teaching explore the relationship between language, meaning-making, power, identity, and ideology in education. Through critical, queer, and decolonial paradigms, Navan's works seek to bridge the theory, research, and practice in contextually relevant ways that further social justice. Navan is currently a lecturer in applied language and literacy studies at the University of Strathclyde, the UK Literacy Association's president-elect, and a co-editor of the Reading Teachers Journal. These are very short introductions of these two people. If I carry on, it will be the whole session. So I'll stop here and Khatija, over to you.
Thank you very much, Saima, for that lovely introduction. I always seem to prefer the one that says I'm a primary school teacher by trade. I'm just going back to grassroots. But what I'll do is I'll attempt to share my slides. I know it worked earlier, so fingers crossed we managed to get it again. Here we go. And if you just let me know if it's on presenter mode. One second, I'll try it again. Are you able to see that, Saima? Yes?
Yes, you can, yes.
Okay, grand, fantastic. So yeah, thank you again for, I suppose, holding space for me at this BERA event, learning about race equality, inequality in education and the work we're doing in Scotland. And I guess I was speaking at a recent event and it was really around, that in our current, I guess, sort of educational landscape, there's borders. Borders are not only, I would say, fences or checkpoints. They're absolutely embedded within our classrooms, our institutions, and conversations we are told not to have often. And I suppose a lot of the sort of barriers and borders that we face manifest as silences. And so with so much uncertainty across the globe, it's so important for us as educators, particularly teacher educators, to engage with this uncertainty. And that includes the past, the present, and the future, which absolutely is a call for ongoing conversations and research, I guess, into the nexus between theory and practice. And global education is needed more than ever before, as we've witnessed, through the COVID pandemic, which sparked incidents of racism and class lines. There was the murder of George Floyd, resurgence of the BLM movement, the escalating conflict in Israel-Palestine, the silencing and censoring around this space, the UK race riots, the ongoing war in Ukraine, Iran. Need I go on? Are all reminders of modern tribalism and conflicts of that arise from race, class, nationality, empire and religion, all volatile, I would argue, fault lines that can erupt anywhere at any time. And as someone, I suppose, who has worked for over 30 years in Scottish education, I've really come to understand that resistance doesn't always appear as loud protest, should I say, or sometimes resistance is in the quiet, persistent reclaiming of voice, in perhaps the unlearning, in the retelling, but in the refusal to be erased. So I suppose my ask of you this afternoon is, let me walk with you this afternoon through what I'm arguing is a decolonising practice that begins not only in policy halls, but absolutely steeped in grassroots lived experience through the lens of our anti-racism framework in Scotland. So it's really important to begin to think about how we move forward there. And the biggest thing for me really here is the myth busting, because oftentimes I come across this well-worn myth that racism doesn't exist here in Scotland. We're all Jock Tamson's bears. It's often used to imply inclusivity. But what it actually does, I guess, is mask deep inequalities. And, the work of some of our Scottish colleagues, Davidson and his colleagues at the University of Glasgow, we must ask, whose comfort does this work protect and whose experience does it render invisible? To say there is no racism here is not only untrue, it is harmful. And it actually also allows our institutions to overlook the very people most impacted by racism. And I think that's something that we need to be holding at the forefront of our conversations. Naming racism in Scottish education is something that we absolutely had to grapple with over the last, I suppose, few decades. But this idea around anti-racism is not just about condemning violence abroad. There's various elements to that. Sheikh Obayo died here in Scotland, and the justice system still fails his family when teachers responded with hostility to Black Lives Matter, when they said all lives matter without understanding the context. It revealed how poorly we have equipped educators to understand racism. It's not just a personal insult. It is institutional, it is cultural, it is systemic, and it absolutely thrives in silence. And, I suppose we're currently wrestling with some explosive geopolitical, spaces where political leaders have legitimised, I guess, the diminishment of debate, dismissed people with opposing views as bigots, shut down informed arguments. And in a time when you can only be one thing or another, for or against, nothing quite sums up that willful ignorance, I guess, that's playing out. Political dissent is repressed, political language is policed. And in a recent article in The Guardian, I'm trying to remember the author's name, I have to remember the name, Mustafa Bayoumi, on the 6th of July, he talked about, the destruction of Palestine as breaking the world. I would argue that the world is on its knees. We're living in a new era of lawlessness, and this is not about the lack of law, it's about remaking the law. What Trump and leaders like him seek is not so much to destroy the law as to colonise it and to determine the parameters and serve their interests. And so from that perspective, something quite concerning. In a more sort of local aspect from Scotland, we had thousands of letters from children and young people. So about 2,000 young people sent letters into our Deputy First Minister telling them about the experiences, the racism that they're experiencing in their schools across Scotland. And that really sparked a conversation with key stakeholders and leaders in education to say something needs to be done here. And in the face of that, there was also my research around the lived experiences of teachers of colour. And that study really took me into a space where I started to think about representation matters. You know, in Scotland, there are teachers of colour represent 1.8% of the workforce. And you break that down, I think it's around 2.3% secondary, 1.9% primary. I'm not sure if my figures are exact, so forgive me. But yet too many BME educators in Scotland work in what Rita Coley will refer to as hostile racial climates. They face peer racism, because in the conversations we were having, we talked very comfortably about children being racist to children, or children being racist to their teacher, or a teacher being racist to a child. But the elephant in the staff room was the racism that a teacher was experiencing from a fellow colleague. So they face a system that demands their labour but refuses their leadership. We do not have, I think, 0.1% of our teachers of colour are in leadership positions. They pay, I would argue, a minority tax. They carry the burden of educating others about race. They also absorb the microaggressions that they themselves experience. So in terms of our leadership here, we must begin to dismantle the structures that uphold these inequities. Teachers of colour are in absolute need of epistemic justice. And, you know, my research explored some of those challenges and enablers that they continue to face. Their stories of becoming, their stories of being and belonging in the teaching profession, I guess, or argue, are displays of resistance, are displays of perhaps reclaiming some of those spaces and beginning to think about bolder and braver spaces where they have not just psychological safety, because we talk a lot about that, but psychological agency, and that's really important in some of the work that we're doing in Scotland. So this, back to this sort of the idea of the road less travelled, and you know, the sort of milestones that we have reached over the last few years. I mean, you know, the initial teacher education framework, the anti-racism in education programme, all wasn't created sitting in boardrooms, or, you know, it was absolutely born from those 2,000 letters that I'd said to you that were sent by young people themselves. It is young people in Scotland who are leading anti-racist change in many ways, and we must listen to them. The new National Anti-Racism Framework for Initial Teacher Education was commissioned by our Scottish Council of Deans, and, you know, could be used as a really powerful tool, but only if it's used effectively. And I'll say a wee bit about that later. I mean, we've currently got a fantastic network called the Anti-Racism in Teacher Education Network, so our Right Network, where we've got members of all of our 11 teacher education providers. So in Scotland, we've got 19 universities, of which 11 of them provide teacher education programmes. So we have all of them as part of this network, working their way through the framework and creating action plans for their own institutions in terms of how they are working through the framework, and beginning to think about the change that needs to happen. So, you know, the framework does demand that we embed racial literacy, curriculum reform, and essentially have honest dialogue right at the heart of teacher education. And I think that's going to be key moving forward, that we sustain those conversations as we move forward. And, you know, so we've been on a journey, and part of that journey has been stemmed from way back in 2018 when we looked at this need for this. Why is it that teachers of colour are so underrepresented in Scotland? And then we moved into that phase of tackling racial harassment because of the EHRC report in 2019, where as a sector in HE in Scotland, we looked at and made a bold commitment to tackle racism and commit to anti-racist practice. So, and in that space also, we've been having some reform in Scotland, really discussions around where are we going with our education system in Scotland. And just interestingly here, you know, I was very much part of this Putting Learners at the Centre. Professor Ken Muir had invited me to be a member of this particular expert steering group. And it's just interesting that when you're in those spaces, having conversations, this is where it goes beyond representation, because a lot of the contributions that I made, I felt at first didn't really translate into the drafts of some of these documents. And so it really does, you know, think about the voices, whose voices are being heard and prioritised, and how does that sit within the broader structures. But interestingly, we had a report done by a very dear colleague of mine, Professor Aileen Kennedy, and a team of professionals looking at measuring quality in initial teacher education. And Aileen will say this herself, the sample in terms of our Black and minority ethnic students was so small that, again, that representation was a real issue. But actually, the comment made in the document was that there's no real crisis in ITE. And I was kind of wanting to sort of differ, I guess, in that space and say, well, if you are from a Black and minority ethnic background, and you identify as, you know, as a teacher of colour or student teacher of colour, there absolutely exists a real crisis. As I would argue, they continue to be invisible in research, policy and practice. And there's something really important for us to begin to grapple with that space. And in some shape or form, the framework kind of addresses that in many ways. So, you know, in teacher education, we can see quite clearly here that there were ongoing challenges around, we had this very soft approach, I would argue, to what I'm referring to as multiculturalism. My own experience decades ago within ITE, my current experience in teaching ITE students was very much about where do we talk about racism, anti-racist practice, decolonising praxis, and it was very much in certain particular pockets. We talked about diversity and difference, didn't really talk about specifically around anti-racist practice. And there was some resistance there as well in terms of resistance by our students, but even so from some of our own teacher education colleagues, ignoring issues of racism, power and whiteness within teacher education, within education more broadly. Actually, I'd written a piece for the Runnymede Trust in 2020, where I'm arguing that whiteness and racism are conversations that are missing within Scottish education. And we've come some way since then, where we boldly mention that terminology. We talk openly about critical race theory, but that lack of diverse recruitment is still very much an issue here in Scotland. But the framework, you know, teacher educators, I would argue, you know, we absolutely should be critically engaging with how our own understandings and narratives of identity and diversity have developed in order to inform our pedagogic interactions with our students, you know, how we are involved in designing teaching across our ITE programmes, undertaking observations of our student teachers, and so on and so forth, and then the need for that to be more sophisticated and nuanced in understanding how race impacts in school settings every day, having that real understanding of what it means to be anti-racist, and, you know, provide that critical lens and confidence, I guess, to act against racism, homophobia, and so on, and actively promote social justice within those spaces. And, you know, the other aspect I often talk about in terms of teacher, you know, the framework is also this notion that we tend to have that diverse teachers for diverse learners. I was recently part of a symposium around the report that UNESCO had produced around leadership in education. It was so interesting because the picture on the front cover was of a hijab wearing woman, and the title beneath it said leadership in education. And it was a real kind of, position that I was looking at thinking, wow, I don't often associate a woman with a hijab in a leadership position. But actually, as you go through the document, there are some real issues around, some really good research around saying that, depending on teachers who are from diverse backgrounds really help in that space of reducing exclusion for diverse learners, but it also helps them in terms of their literacy and numeracy and talking about representation and role models. But actually, there's a broader argument here that I think often is missed, that diverse teachers are there for not just diverse learners, but for all learners. And it's something we need to hold, as we move with these discussions. So yeah, it's something that's been really kind of, and I want to write more about that space, but we'll come to another point. But in terms of the framework, here are some of the key themes that are included in the framework, because in Scotland for us, it really was that piece of why is it that in our ITE programmes, we tend to only capture one or two, and I know certainly UWS, we're a smaller provider, so the numbers are further reduced. But across some of our partners who have larger numbers of students, we still see students of colour in a real minority space. So it was really to grapple with the idea of what about the marketing of our ITE programmes? What about that recruitment space? And then across the themes around racial literacy of our teacher educators, teacher identity and so on. And I'll take each of them and just talk across them kind of more in terms of how we saw it from a sort of Scottish perspective. And so really that sort of marketing space as well for me was, we often use these stock images, and oftentimes when our students come onto campus and they go, oh gosh, that's not what I was sold really. And it's about saying, let's take care in how we market, let's tell the true story around that space. And that how we really are absolutely wishing to encourage that ethnic diversity. But also in the recruitment space, some of our students go through interviews and really review some of those traditional practices. I know that here in UWS, we used to have a space where we would invite head teachers to come along and join in the interviews. But again, just be very aware that some of them may lack any contemporary understanding of racial injustice and equity. And it's those kind of dealing with sort of inherent implicit biases that might often come to the fore within those spaces too. Again, thinking about the questions that we ask, really important. Some of the power imbalances that exist in those spaces are key for us to begin to look at more carefully. So yeah, just for me that, avoiding stereotypes about how a student teacher should act, should look, should talk. Really important for us to challenge some of those stereotypes. But for me, this is really close to my heart in terms of the racial literacy and teacher educators, and it's, for me, it's an essential part of the component, not an optional part of it. How racially literate are we truly? And what it means for us is that the naming and the framing and actually really addressing racism in all its forms. It's also thinking about how we understand the ways that race intersects with gender, class, and the multiple intersecting identities in those spaces, and how it begins to shape our worldview. I often am in conversations where there's a real defensiveness when whiteness is mentioned. And I remember a colleague saying to me, oh my goodness, I'm so pleased that you've mentioned, whiteness and fragility within the framework. And I think it's really important for us to push through some of that discomfort, and the argument, that a leader, a teacher educator, a teacher who can can really deconstruct some of that is far better positioned to see perhaps why some of our pedagogical and curricular patterns might not be fit for purpose. And this is where that change begins. And, you know, and this is where I think that leadership begins in that space. I'll move along. I'm just conscious of time. I don't want to speak. I know you've got a great presentation from Nuvan waiting after me. So this idea of teacher identity and positionality again features very strongly in the framework, because of course we know, colleagues, that identity is not fixed and we all hold multiple shifting identities. You know, I'm not only a teacher or only a woman, I am all of these things at once, and so are our students. And students and educators should engage with racial identity development frameworks, really helping us to define ourselves, connect with one another, and organise on behalf of our shared interests. And for me, I think it really helps to generate solidarity when we support teachers to explore their positionality, their place in systems of power and identity. You know, that we support authentic teaching. We allow them to bring their whole selves into the classroom, into our spaces. And that in turn allows our young people to do the same. And so, you know, it really is important that, you know, as again I said, I don't speak not just as an educator, but as a Scottish Muslim woman of Pakistani and Indian heritage. I'm a mother, I'm a teacher, and my life stories have shaped how I teach and how I lead. And, you know, oftentimes when I say to colleagues, just have that conversation with yourself about, when I look in the mirror, what do you see? You know, and I see, for me, a woman of colour, you know, with a slanty, squinty smile, a colourful hijab, and somewhere in that image, I still see the lingering effect from, I guess, years of confusion and complexity around who I thought I needed to be. You know, I remember my father sharing stories with my sister and I about the posters on folks' windows, you know, the no Irish, no blacks, no dogs, and how this made me feel when you know, how it made him feel when he first arrived in the UK back in 1968. And, you know, it was such an interesting conversation with him at that time. And I lost myself for a while also in my own experience in Scotland when I argued, denied the right to be Khadija, where my teachers exercised their power to rename me because it was too much to get my name right, where I lost my mother tongue, Punjabi, as it was clearly not valued. And like my father, I guess I learned to play white. And that was my strategy to survive. And I think, you know, something for us to take away from that, and that really helped me to think about that whole identity piece. And fast forward several decades, you know, I argued that when I was writing the framework, I felt in many ways there was change, but there was nothing much that had changed, nothing substantial. And I still find that I'm supporting the only student of colour on our ITE programme who looks to me for support. And again, I'm saying this in jest, not that my other colleagues would not be supporting, absolutely. And it's back to that, you know, that representation. It's back to those role models, that somebody you can relate to or feel that you can relate to better. And they look to me for support, and I can't help but notice how desperately that one student will seek that validation, that sense of belonging, which I too, I think, have yearned for years in the academy as a teacher educator of colour myself. So yeah, really important. And I think, yeah, far too often educators, implicitly or explicitly, are told to leave part of themselves at the door. And, you know, Jim Cummins' famous line for me, leave your language and culture at the school front door. That loss of self is not a small thing. Anti-racist leadership begins when we stop asking people to cut themselves in two and really begin to think about that transformation and reflection, that positionality which informs our professional practice. And in that sense, I included the 4A's model that stemmed from my research around strengthening that professional identity from not a deficit perspective, from an absolute asset-based perspective, that as a person who identifies from a diverse ethnic background, what about that whole identity and actually beginning to grapple with some of that? So the 4A's model around the acknowledgement piece of validating those experiences, communicated and shared in safe spaces, the affirmation of recognising that added value, that cultural wealth that our students of colour bring to our teacher education spaces, to our workspaces and the wider professional community, and in a strengthening of that professional, to that psychological agency of bringing their true selves into those spaces, being comfortable in wanting to, of those who have expressed that, to decolonise the curriculum and not being seen as problematic and causing trouble, and so on and so forth. That building capacity is so important. And Rita Coley's quote here, I think, is so powerful, because I was exactly one of those students that where you grow up and become teachers without that space to critically reflect and heal from those experiences that you've had, you take those problematic beliefs into the classroom yourself. And I know that I did that for many years, and when I reflect back on it, I'm often thinking of the number of young people that I now feel that I failed in that space. So just very quickly, another part of the theme in the framework is about that anti-racist curriculum, that decolonising practice, bringing thought into action. So important for us, because praxis is where ideas become action. It's in that decolonial work that, that this means that questioning whose knowledge is seen as legitimate and what is ignored. And asking us to centre lived experience not as anecdote, but as theory. It means building pedagogy that draws from the margins, not just the canon. And, even in Scotland, we have a fantastic radical youth group, Intercultural Youth Scotland, who did a study. And in that study, they said that young people said their curriculum did not reflect their lived experience. In fact, 72% said English literature excluded their cultural identity, their culture entirely. Colleagues' representation isn't a luxury, it's essential to belonging, and our young people themselves are demanding that change. Their letters to the Deputy First Minister, their stories, their truths, they are at the heart of our breaking the mould anti-racist curriculum principles. And, the young people are driving that space, and it's becoming that sort of starting point to our curriculum. And for me, that is absolutely anti-racist leadership from our children and young people. These principles have been created as part of our work in the Anti-Racism in Education programme. We have 4 work streams, and in the curriculum reform stream, we've had young people. In fact, it was a young person that entitled our curriculum principles as Breaking the Mould, a set for educators and a set for young people. And we really do see that as an integral part of the work that we're doing here in Scotland. And there's also those conversations about distinction between an inclusive curriculum, a decolonised curriculum, and an anti-racist curriculum, because oftentimes they're all conflated into that inclusive space. But yeah, placement is another key aspect for us colleagues in that framework, because a quote from one of my students was, placement was really tough, Khadija. I could do nothing right. I constantly sought feedback, but it was not forthcoming. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It wasn't, it was just that look, the subtle, slight look that I would get, and at times some stereotypical comments about my culture. My tutor observed my teaching and found it to be satisfactory, but the class teacher marked me unsatisfactory in every category. How do I begin to understand that? I tried to challenge this at the university. I even went to the dean, only to be told that their partnership with the school was so important, and that they needed to support the assessment of the school. And again, colleagues, I would maybe urge, and that's what part of that framework does, is prompt some of these questions to encourage us to begin to think about how are we absolutely supporting in that place, and are we asking the right questions? And you can again see from some of these quotes here as well, some of the questions that our students are having to deal with themselves, and that identity piece really would support in these areas too. So just very quickly, to take us to a finishing point, because I think probably, Simon, I'm so sorry, I'm probably well over my time, but we need to, anti-racist leadership means making space for discomfort, colleagues. I mean, I know we've probably talked about that often in different spaces, and it means acting even when it's difficult, and it means practicing fierce solidarity in the face of, oftentimes what we get is pushback, that whataboutery and that institutional gatekeeping. White allies will also face challenges too. You may be labelled, you may be excluded, you may be dismissed as well, like your fellow colleagues of colour, but the work must go on and it must be shared. And so in closing, as I finish this, and I hold in mind those, I guess, the giants before us who have led and spoken and carried this work long before I or anybody else stood here. In fact, I was doing a keynote at the University of Suffolk, and I had the privilege of meeting Professor Heidi Sophia Mirza. So those whose stories were ignored, those whose names we don't even know, I guess. So anti-racism leadership is not for me a title, it's a stance, a daily, difficult, necessary stance. And I'm hoping that the framework in Scotland will make some inroads into that space. And I guess also be used as a form of sponsorship, as a form of advocacy, to really bring that authenticity to our teacher education spaces. And, in the true words of Dr. APG Abdul Kalam, what are you prepared to risk to lift someone else higher? And I'll stop there, Saima. Sorry, I've probably gone way over my time.
No, it was, as always, very powerful, very strong, and it didn't feel like that. You have done more than 30 minutes. Thank you very much, Khatija, and we'll be back to you during the discussion time. Yes, Naman, over to you. You don't need to rush. We have a time.
Okay. Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen. Can I check that you can see this in presentation mode?
Yes, we can.
Okay, that's perfect. Thank you. All right. So good afternoon, everyone. I think it's both a privilege and a tough act to follow after Khadija. So I do want to say two things. One is Khadija's work, as we'll see, has become unbelievably vital, particularly in relation to, one, the constant kind of activist undertones that it helps to mobilize, but also in, in the work that contributed to and kind of coalesced into this anti-racist framework for ITE, which is applicable to education more broadly, really has a legitimizing effect. So for those of us who are also working in teacher education or in other spaces in education, having folks like Khadija and colleagues and a history of anti-racist scholarship and activism, critical theory making, and kind of grassroots work really means that it provides a strong foundation for. There is someone's mic. Really provides a strong foundation for those of us who are still entering and establishing ourselves in these spaces to make the work happen, to take it in, to build onto it, to contribute to a growing network. The second thing is, as you'll see from the title on my slide, that what I'm going to talk about is slightly different from what was advertised, but still connected. So I have spoken about the work that I've been doing with ITE, with the ITE program, the PGDE English program, and kind of using critical literacies to make the decolonial turn. But what I'm going to talk about today is actually a more recent project that I've been working with in collaboration with ScotDec and WASDec, colleagues from those organizations, and specifically the crafting of or co-designing an anti-racist English education, and our role in supporting that. So I'll talk about that a little more because there's new data and some emerging findings that I hope will be really interesting. I also hope hope that this will provide a bit of insight into how those frameworks that Khadija was talking about and how some of those principles filter into different spaces, particularly here where I'm talking about quite a disciplinary specific space as well. All right, so just to acknowledge that this is collaborative. So I, as a lecturer of applied language and literacy studies at the University of Strathclyde and the Institute of Education there, have been working very closely with Titilayo Farukoye, who is an anti-racist educator, activist, and poet. And their work has been fundamental to this, as well as working with Charlotte Dwyer and Jennifer Buchan, from ScotDec and their sibling organization WASDEC. And both ScotDec and WASDEC are global citizenship organizations, charities, and what they do is they produce or co-produce teacher and research-informed educational materials specifically tailored for global citizenship education. And so in 2024, ScotDec was commissioned by Education Scotland to take the anti-racist education initiative further by further developing some of those materials. And so Charlotte and Jennifer approached TT and myself to support them in that endeavor, right? And so we would bring in kind of the practitioner, but also activists and research and theory building and work with teachers, right? So I'll tell you a little more about what the project looks like, but it's important to maybe signpost to a whole range of contextual kind of factors that feed into why this work is important and how we hope we contribute to this growing body of work, particularly in Scotland. So one, we're contributing to Education Scotland Anti-Racist Ed.Scot initiative, and in response to their curriculum improvement cycle, which is currently ongoing. We're also seeing as part of that curriculum improvement cycle that critical literacies is becoming a more prominent feature, as well as the previous iterations of social justice education, and that being kind of a key indicator or key component of new teachers' professional standards becoming more and more kind of solidified in our policy. And then we have kind of the policy and research context. So over and above mobilizing or finding ways to operationalize the National Framework for Anti-Racism in ITE, also finding that there's only an emerging set of data around what anti-racism practice looks like, what pedagogy and curriculum looks like in the Scottish context. And so what there is out there is there's a dearth of information, effectively. And so though there are a few folks working in these areas, we really need to continue building the database to understand, well, how are these frameworks being taken into different educational spaces? What are the effects, particularly in the longer term? And how do we speak back to the ongoing kind of normative discourses around no problem here, right? So we hope to contribute to that policy and research shift. We also note that, as Khadija outlined, there are a number of ongoing divisive, we find ourselves in divisive times, right? So we have, again, ongoing calls to decolonize education, calls for intersectional justice, so to see social issues and power in more and more complex ways. And as part of solidarity building, we see ourselves in an increasingly far-right conservatism where LGBTQIA rights, race equality, and immigration are suddenly coming into crisis, and some of those policies and laws are rolling back in many ways as well. That increasing far-right conservatism is also becoming more vocal and prominent in spaces. So even where they represent a minority perspective or viewpoint, they're actually taking up a lot of intellectual and physical space sometimes. We also see that there's an increase in online misinformation, disinformation, and far-right radicalization. And although there have been responses to that, so on the right-hand side, you can see that there's key texts like Black Out Here by Subanda and Hill, which really pulls together a history of activism and scholarship in anti-racism in Scotland. But then we also have these headlines of people being targeted for supporting Palestine, or students walking out. So we're also seeing a more critically conscious and socially aware student body enter our universities, but also our schools. And with that information, on that misinformation, disinformation circulating online, we also have interesting ties to solidarity. So TIE Campaign, which is Time for Inclusive Education, and predominantly drives LGBT inclusive education in Scotland, have also developed a digital discourse initiative in conjunction with ISD, which is the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. And in these resources really speak about a wide range of issues, including gender-based violence, radicalization in terms of misogyny, anti-LGBTQ misinformation, as well as the circulation of racist information online as well. And so we see that there are all of these initiatives and a range of cultural, political, and social events that really make this work prominent. So in the project, when my colleagues from ScotDec approached me alongside TT, we were really there to support teachers and ScotDec colleagues in producing, co-designing these anti-racist English education materials. This came at a key time, again, because of all of those kind of policy shifts, the gap in the research, as well as the ongoing kind of call in the kind of politics and society and culture, asking for more criticality. And so what we did was we tried to formulate this in relation to critical race literacies. So my background in critical literacies means that we were able to talk about language, meaning making, power, and identity. And so if I speak really quickly about critical literacy itself, it's often described as the linguistic arm of critical pedagogies and is born from Paulo Freire's work. It has come to be a complex and interdisciplinary field that explores the relationship between communication, meaning-making, power, and identity in social and cultural context. And so one of its key kind of underpinning questions that it allows us to ask really is, how is language and other modes of communication used to construct different relations of power? Right? So in English education, where texts, where language, literature, and meaning making are kind of the bread and butter of our subject area and the core of what it is we're teaching, but also how we teach, understanding that language is connected to these things, to issues of power, to society, becomes really key. And so we matched this up with anti-racist education, specifically drawing on critical race theory, which again, through a long history of interdisciplinary activism, research, and educational practice, provides an acute lens for understanding race as a social, cultural, and political formation of power. Right? So really it allows us to hone in on a particular type of relationship or power relationship. And so specifically, we draw on its recognition that race is a social construct, which produces lived social realities across interpersonal, internalized, institutional, and systemic or ideological dimensions. And so for the folks that we're working with, and again, in very practical terms of stepping into the English education classroom, we're allowed to ask, how are race, culture, and ethnicity constructed through texts? And so texts become a way for us to engage with anti-racism, racism, and the construct of race in an English education space. So bringing critical literacies together with critical race theory in the form of anti-racist education, thus allows us to understand English education as a space for investigating these two overarching questions, right? And so that question of why English education also means that we need to contextualize the subject and the field critically as well. So in the manifesto that Ian Cushing and I published last year, and talking about, well, what does this mean for a UK context, and how do we envision an anti-racist English education, given the wide-ranging kind of politics across all four nations of the UK, but also the strong tradition of activism in and for education across the UK. And so we determined that there were four premises of power in English education: that English teachers, English language, literacy, and literature teachers really need to acknowledge when they step into the subject area. And that is, one, English is a colonial language of power. Standardized and academic English are linguistic varieties of power. Language is a communicative mode of power. And finally, there's a long list of entangled ideologies, but that these entangled ideologies of power are operationalized through language. So in other words, language is one means to make power real and has very material consequences as well as representational consequences. So it's the if you can't see it, then you can't be it kind of discourse. But then also if you can't see it, then, or you don't see a certain type of person being represented, then that person, that body, is not necessarily included in the production of those texts. And so coming into contact with texts that invisibilize us means that we start to embody that invisibilization, embody that marginalization as well. We start to internalize it. And so within this context of critical race literacies and understanding the place of English education and its history as a language of power, we co-constructed a set of workshops. So one, there were only 3 workshops. So there's a certain number of caveats that we had to work with, and which did make it a little tricky. But it also just means that there's scope to expand a lot of this work, right? So with a selection of 14 teachers and broadly educated participants, we designed 3 workshops. We focused each workshop on a different area of critical race literacy, each building off of the next. So workshop 1 is around framing and really allowed us to talk about key principles and to understand how key principles, or these critical literacies and anti-racist education, differed, as well as identified how they overlapped, so how they might inform each other. This information from workshop 1 and the work that participants produced was then used to develop workshop 2, which was to scaffold in-class learning and the design of question chains. So really move toward, well, what does this look like in terms of pedagogy? What are the types of teacherly decisions that are possible to be made? And then how do we capture, because what emerged from, as we'll see, what emerged from workshop 1 was that there was an emerging meta language of race and power coming from our participants in our dialogue together. And then finally, workshop 3, which was really focused on action, which was how do we move beyond, say, taking that theory and research and implementing it in curriculum and pedagogical design, and actually think about, well, what do children and young people do with that information once they've critiqued a text? It's also important to note that of the 14 teachers that attended, only 3 were people of color. All the teachers, however, had completed the Building Racial Literacies program. And so we see how this influenced their interactions and engagement throughout later on. Each session was only 2 hours long. And then we applied what we call a critical socio-material analysis of facilitator reflections, so as well as participants' discursive work. So as you'll see, the kinds of texts they produced and the notes that they made, and how that enabled us to capture dialogue, but also knowledge making and practice in the generation of curriculum and pedagogical practice in those moments. Yeah, so I'll move on really quickly because I'm already running out of time, and try and get into some of the meat of it, right? So workshop 1, which was on framing, we used this particular text. So this is an advert which is semi-anonymized, but was published in Esquire magazine. If you look kind of carefully, so it's tried to mist out the details, but there's a man holding a head on the bottom left-hand corner of the image, and the tagline is "Re-civilize yourself." So it's for a cosmetics company, men's cosmetics, and the model himself is an African man and has very short cropped hair, and the mannequin head that he's holding has kind of what might be termed as like unkempt hair, is meant to portray unkempt hair. But this being published in 2011, there's a whole lot of information out there about how all the negative kind of criticism that this advert and this campaign received. And so it really produces and reproduces racial stereotypes about African hair, African identity, in it, and ties it into this idea of re-civilization. Civilization is part of that kind of ongoing colonial discourse, as well as being entangled with masculinities. And so we asked our participants to work with this text to try and identify how power and race were being produced. So again, going back to those core questions, 2 things to mention is that 1, yes, we did opt to use quite a provocative text that would elicit discussion and would be uncomfortable. But we thought that this would be productive because we had spent quite a bit of time working with participants on establishing conversation guidelines, as well as working on positionality statements before diving into this. The participants then worked in small groups to highlight those textual features, those discursive features in the text. And so what we did is we gathered all of those annotated adverts and pulled them together to collate all the information, collate the annotations. And what emerged was this meta language for power and race. So we started to see that actually folks were very capable of identifying things when given the time, but also very astute at seeing that, that some of the features of the text were able to create relationships of power more broadly, while some were specifically targeted to producing particular ideas, representations of race and gender. And then we found that those were entangled, that actually gender in this advert supported the production of race, and that race supported the production of gender, and that these things were kind of, because they were so interlocked, it really just meant that the production of like African masculinities, Black masculinities, was taking a very particular shape. But being able to kind of see that as a whole text meant one thing, and then trying to tease out, well, what were the choices that went into producing this text? And so this led on to discussions about how advertising campaigns work through processes of decision-making and review, suggesting that this text was viewed again and again, edited and refined before being approved for publication across multiple media. And so that kind of contextualization in the production of the text itself started to help us understand that actually this is not just representational, and it's not just about this text, it's about an entire institution and network that is able to produce this, and that this doesn't just happen by happenstance, but actually there are much bigger issues at play. Very quickly, we then in workshop 2 sought to take this further by asking folks to work with Lucan Free Bodies for resources model, which really matches individual kind of word level analysis all the way up to comprehension, as well as text, which connects. So teachers and learners are encouraged to make connections between the choices that text designers and authors make at the word level, how it produces whole text meaning, but then how that then contributes to and is connected to broader social issues, right? And in these examples, again, I will try say this really quickly, is we opted to use a familiar text for English educators in Scotland. So using Liz Lochhead's kids poem, or Bensang, which is written in a combination of standardized English and Scots language. And what we started to find was that, one, when we matched it up with a Scottish writer of color, so next, the second image is I Was Born by Jetta Paul, published in 2024, that actually rubbing texts up against each other expose how race becomes invisibilized in one text on its own, but actually bringing more voices, bringing more diverse representations and voices and perspectives into conversation with each other, exposed issues of racism, but also anti-racism. I will move very quickly. So just to show you this, what had started to emerge then was what we call the grammars of power and racialization. And so what's important to note in these is that the particular grammar of racialization includes some things to there's a lot of text on the screen, but is that identity markers started to help us understand that even in text, so even in linguistic text where through narrative, bodies are read, and that there are certain tropes, certain representations that emerge again and again, and that unless we're able to pinpoint them, name them, and explain the consequences of them or the effects of them in text, and that then we're less able to become racially literate. Intersectionality surfaced as the recognition that constructions of race, racism, and even anti-racism, often perhaps always entangled with constructions of other identities, so that in terms of constructions of gender, but that this was also connected to colorblindness and color avoidance, so that there is a constant need to actively address race and racism in order to avoid colorblindness, and that sometimes race and racism fall by the wayside if other intersecting issues of power or identity are privileged in our minds and in the dominant discourses around us. And finally, we leveraged text selection. So some of the key findings, sort of this and one more slide, some of the key findings is that this enabled teachers so this co-design, this co-analysis enabled teachers to see the discursive production of race and racism, right? And then again, pinpoint, this maybe goes back to the reason we called it the grammar of racialization. So we really started to see that those practices of identifying and naming race and racism in context and applying it to taken for granted text, we moved closer and closer to understanding how race and racism are produced by and through the text, but also how it might be produced through our own reading of the text. And for this reason, we avoid the term grammar of race or racism and rather speak of racialization as a discursive process of making and being made racialized subjects, which have very real social and material consequences. And so in terms of the educational implications that we see from this, emerging from this ongoing project, is that one thing, like the network of resources and interventions elsewhere, so like the Building Racial Literacies program, primes teachers for more advanced critical race and anti-racist practice and knowledge building. So we need to actually build onto each other and connect to each other in more significant ways. That these teachers needed or really benefited from targeted collaborative professional development because it contributed toward contextually and culturally relevant learning. So it was really situated in our curriculum, in their experiences, and really we really valued the information that our participants brought to the space as well. And we learned so much from each other. And then to foster learners' critical race literacy depends on our commitment to fostering teachers' critical race literacy. And then for English education, we recognize that English remains a language of power, demonstrating the continued need for critical literacies at large, and that English language and literacy education is well suited for nurturing learners' critical consciousness across analytical, emotional, and imaginative dimensions. And so critical literacies, racial literacies is both a way of being and doing, but in its critical race literacy form, attention is given to connecting the nuances of discursive or text design and meaning-making practices with that of the social function of text and the politics of race and racism and anti-racism in context. So thank you very much. Despite having, I think, technically extra time, I'm sure we've run out of time now. I'll stop
Thank
there.
you very much. Thank you very much, Navan. It was really nice, and thank you very much for sharing your most recent work.